Good evening and welcome. We are in our Northwest College 1010 class. This is meeting number 2, May the 21st, 2014. Let's kind of talk through just a few things here real quickly before we get to the lecture of the hour. We want to start first of all by outlining the meeting number 2 cover sheet, which is of course your cover sheet of this evening. Probably not a bad idea to have it in front of you. And as we go through then this first this first cover sheet, if you need to add anything, feel free to do that right now, handwriting. And if you have to make major overhauls, then you can always hand in to me tomorrow. But basically, the way it works for handing materials in late is that we normally will ask of you that you are handing stuff in on the day of the assigned date. If you have to hand in materials late, then you always want to make sure that you're doing it as close to the date it was due. Normally you lose about 10 points for each day that you miss, right? So for example, if you, don't hand in your packet tonight, but you do hand it in tomorrow, then you would receive at least a score of an 80 on the packet, okay? Now if there are extenuating circumstances, then obviously you have to make me aware of those. But that's kind of my, especially in the 1020 class, I really want to commend you to make sure that you get everything in on time. This evening's meeting 2 cover sheet should be in this order. You ought to have your bullet point notes of pages 1 through 58. You ought to have your bullet point and your annotation work for pages 633 to 641 and 655 to 664. Again, the rule is very simple. Any time that you're dealing with an actual text that you're doing an annotation over, you want to always provide the title and the page number from the ARPS text. So however many texts there are that are a part of that 633 to 641, 655 to 664, you want to be sure that you're that you've listed those. And then finally, you'll have your annotation over the Updike poem, Great Scarf of Birds, and you'll have the essay that you wrote over Updike's Great Scarf of Birds, and that again will call on your cover sheet a writing diagnostic. It's actually a reading and a writing diagnostic. Okay, so in other words, it just kind of tells me a little bit of how well at the beginning of our time together you can do those things. All right? Just to remind you, no class next Monday. That is holiday, May the 26th, but we will come back then for meeting number 3 on May the 28th. Let's go ahead now and outline the cover sheet for May the 28th. And of course, it might make sense for you to have a blank sheet of paper out. It might make sense as well for you to maybe be working with the course outline, right? So you're kind of looking at the dates there in front of you. For meeting 28, your packet for meeting number 3 again will always be 2 parts. Part 1 will be your annotation work. Part 2 will be your formal paper, and in this case it's formal paper number 1. The first thing that you want to do is to list the 10 poems that are listed there, starting with compare on 642 and ending with rose on 729. Again, you always want to provide the poem, the author, if one is provided, unless it's an anonymous source, and then of course the page number from ARPS where it appears. All right, so you're always wanting to make sure that you have that information. All right, compare, red, mirror, world, 35/10, Sunday's Harlem Star, morning, and rose. And if I counted right, that's 10 texts. All right, so you've got 10 texts that you're working with, okay? And then we've got a paper that we also want to work with. All right, so let's talk about that real quickly. Now, this is paper number 1. Okay, so this is formal paper number 1. And this one will involve the following. Okay, so you want to write this down. Now, just to remind, This is your first formal paper with your 5 references in the MLA style book. Again, you'll be reciting, you'll be citing appropriately using the MLA style book, all that jazz that you learned in your 1010 class. The topic that I'm assigning for this one is 3 messages from one of the assigned poems on page 642 to 729. Or I will allow you in this first paper to consider the Updike poem as an optional poem that you can write on as well. Okay? So I'll give you that opportunity there. Okay? Now, since I said it, and we want to make sure that we're all on board, because right away, unlike the 1010 class, see, I start scoring your papers and your packets right away with a certain eye towards this MLA style book. Let's just make some real quick observations. You've received a packet that is kind of just a review packet for you. This one is, you will see it called the Northwest 1010-1020 Resource Packet. Okay, that's yours to keep. You can put your name on it. And just look at the table of contents there. The first 3 pages are all about research database work. Okay? And the 4th page has to do with, of course, use of Noodle tools to create your bibliography or your works cited page. Page 5 is going to talk about citing internet sources. Page 6 and 7 is going to talk about the MLA style book examples, both in text as well as in text, works cited page. I want to ask you to circle page 8 on the cover sheet. That's your skeleton guide. And of course, I'm expecting that you're going to have learned that kind of information in your 1010 class. You obviously want your paper to follow those guidelines that you learned in 1010. Okay? We will make then a distinction between what we will call in our class, the language will be internal validation. That's when you're quoting from the actual poem that you're writing about. Or external validation. That's when you're quoting from these 5 required sources, external to the poem, external to ARPS, by the way. You can't qualify ARPS as a piece of external validation because this is our textbook, okay? So in other words, you're doing research on whatever poem or author, you know, historic time, whatever, however you want to use to find your research. And then you're going to cite that research again. When you cite using the MLA style book, important that you are providing us with that primary information. Obviously, author's last name. Do not put URL or HTTP addresses inside of your paper, okay? Pages 9 through 14, I think you've seen something like this before. It is a model paper, and it's what I'm expecting your paper to kind of look like in regards to format, okay, format. And pay particular attention to pages 15 and 16 of your packet. That's what your works cited page needs to look like. If it's not, don't look for much over 70 points on your packet. All right? So that's a hypercritical component of our 1020 class. You want to be sure that you are following the MLA style book. All right? And then finally, page 17 is a sample rubric of a way that we would maybe score your papers. You obviously are going to make sure that you're following page 8 of the skeleton guide if you're looking for top marks. It goes without saying that before you hand in a paper to me, make sure that you have at least 2 or 3 sets of eyes look at your paper, try and find the errors and the mistakes, the grammar, and that kind of thing, okay? Now, if you need any kind of help, there are several places that you can go to be reminded of the information that was presented to you in your 1010 class, or I hope was presented to you in your 1010 class. You can go to the online source at the Northwest College website. You go to Hinckley Library, and under Hinckley Library, there will be a series of tutorials for you there. You should have watched those during your 1010 experience. For sure, if you feel like you need some clarification, that's one place to go. Another place to go, and I would really encourage you to write this down, is learnstrong.net, which is my website. where you want to go to the archive material under NWCC down the side for both 1010 and 1020 lectures. So if there's any questions about the MLA style book or quoting or citation, there's several lectures there. Some of those are from my 1010 lectures, and all you have to do is hit it, scroll down, find the one that works for you and watch it. Okay? Finally, you will find the information there on LearnStrong. I think right there on the front, on the home page itself, Paper Rater. I want you to make sure that you put your paper through Paper Rater, okay? Paper Rater is our online source that allows for us to check for plagiarism. Make sure that you do have the plagiarism score provided. You want to print that information for me as part of your paper, okay? So it's a way for us to be sure that you are quoting correctly using Paper Rater, okay? Do you have any questions for me about any of the information that I just presented? Everybody groovy with that? Okay. We're going to turn now to a lecture that I want you, I hope, to flow on an introduction to poetics and the ways in which we can study a poem. All right. I'm going to talk first of all about the two ways that we can read a poem. Now, as I work, I'll also be reviewing this annotation process. Let's review the annotation process one more time just to be clear. When you pick up a work of literature, you are expected to respond to that literature on 3 levels. Okay? We will call it for ease, level 1, level 2A, level 2B, level 3A, level 3B. Okay? Let's review real quickly what that means. At level 1, we are working with a summary level of reading. In other words, we look at John Updike's poem, Great Scarf of Birds, and we simply are able to reduce it to 3 or 4 bullet-pointed observations. The poem basically is about this, then it says this, then it says this. Simply summarizing what we've read. Okay? If it's a short story, we're going to summarize key elements. If it's a play, we're going to summarize key elements. That's all we're doing at level 1. At level 2A, we're going to ask the English teacher question, what does this poem not say, but what does it mean? Here, we're looking again for major themes or messages. So in other words, Great Scarf of Birds is a poem about a guy golfing and he sees some birds that take off. And it looks like a big black scarf when the birds take off. That's what the poem is about. But what does the poem actually mean? Like, what does the poem suggest thematically about any number of topics? Okay, that's a 2A observation. Okay. Level 2B is what we call the rhetorical level of reading. R-H-E-T-O-R-I-C-A-L. Rhetorical. Not what the author says, but how the author says it. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time now talking about, from a poetics point of view, what we mean when we talk about poetic devices. Okay? So, for example, we could look at John Updike's poem, Great Scarf of Birds, from multiple perspectives at level 2B. We could look at, for example, number of lines that he uses, stanza development, meter, rhythm, rhyme, for example. Does he employ end rhyme? Does he or does he not? You see, these are all level 2B questions. And as you get into ARPS, one of the things you're doing is you're using your study of ARPS to help you prepare to respond at 2B to these different poems. As early as next week, 10 of them. 10 of them, all right? By the way, make a note to yourself, for each one of those poems for next week's, next session's packet, give yourself 1 page per each poem. So in other words, your packet will be at least 10 pages long because you'll be working with 10 poems. Does that make sense? Then when we come to class, I will work with some or all of those poems. And then you're obviously taking notes in class. The recommendation is that you do your pre-class notes in red ink and your in-class notes in blue or black ink. Does that make sense? So you can then differentiate between what you were thinking about the poem before you came to class and then what we're saying in class about the poem. Okay? It also allows me to know that we're working with pre-class and in-class notes. At level 3, we're asking the relational question. This is the question about how does the text relate to 3A, other texts I'm familiar with, okay? Things maybe I've seen or been exposed to or listened to. And then of course at 3B we're asking, do I have any personal relationship to this poem or to this text? Have, for example, I ever seen a large flock of birds moving on the breeze to make it look like a scarf in the air or a piece of fabric floating in the air? Have I ever seen that before? Have I ever seen something similar? Have I seen other kinds of wildlife situations, etc., etc., right? I mean, on one hand, you could say that John Updike's poem, Great Scarf of Birds, is nothing more than a tribute poem to nature. Birds are remarkable, you know, that kind of thing. I mean, it's a fairly shallow reading of the poem, I'll agree with you, but it's still a potentiality. And at level 3B, you're trying to say something that's personal that then allows for you to have some level to connect to the poem. Okay? Having said that now, let's spend a little time talking about poetics. Let me begin and preface what I'm about to say by suggesting that you probably have heard most of this before. Okay? I'm reviewing information that was probably taught to you at some point prior in your education, most likely in your high school literature courses and that type of thing. We'll see how much of this for you is new versus review. I'm hoping that most of it's review. We're going to talk about reading a poem, yes, but we're going to talk more about, and we'll say this as well about the other genres of text that we're working with. First poetry, then drama, then short fiction, finally a novel. We're going to talk not only about reading the text, but two other words will come to mind for us. Experiencing a text or appreciating a text. Now notice that I have not mentioned liking the text or disliking the text. We won't speak in language like that. We've left that terrain when we left middle school. I don't like X or Y and therefore I don't want to listen to it or read it or whatever. By the time you've left high school and joined the university experience, one of the great things about being on the college campus is that you are exposed to lots and lots of stuff, much of which you don't necessarily like the first time that you see it or hear it. And then it kind of grows on you. And then you kind of find some appreciation for it, and sometimes even you'll like it. Right? So for example, you start cuisine and trying eating food that you've never tried before. Listening to music, as one of my students once said, I grew up in a town where all I listened to was country music my whole life. I had never heard rap other than it disparaged. My roommate listened to nothing but rap. The first weeks of our rooming together, it was musical war. Who was going to play the country or the rap louder? We came to an agreement that on certain days of the week, country would only be played, and on other days of the week, rap music would be played. And we both admitted that by the end of our semester, it's not that he said, I liked rap music, but I appreciated it in ways I didn't appreciate before. And conversely, he said, my poor roommate had to learn how to live with, at the time Garth Brooks was the popular artist, and had to learn to live with Garth Brooks, you see. So there's this kind of give and take that we might think of, all right? Basically, there's kind of two ways, however, that we're going to look at poetics. First, we're going to look at its form, and then we're going to look at its content. Okay? Form and content. All right? So as you look at these poems coming as early as next session, I want you to begin to give some thought to that. What is the form and what is the content? Okay? Now, fundamentally, really, we're talking about level 2 exposure to a text. That's really what we're talking about. With a little bit of level 1 and level 3 thrown in, but we're really going to focus our attentions at level 2. What does this text mean? Now, of course, you can't really comment at all about John Updike's Great Scarf of Birds unless you've read John Updike's Great Scarf of Birds. Would you agree with me? So in other words, you can't really work level 2 unless you've done level 1. So you got to read the poem and actually try to figure out what the poem is saying. True. But once you've kind of figured out level 1, there's multiple ways to approach and therefore begin to potentially appreciate a text like John Updike's Great Scarf of Birds. Okay. First of all, let's talk about form. When we talk about form, we can talk about organization. We can talk about, in other words, the way it looks on the page. Quite literally, the way it is set on the page. So, for example, if you are looking at John Updike's Great Scarf of Birds, and I would recommend that you have that poem now in front of you, we're going to be referencing it throughout my conversation here. Right away, you can see that it's laid out on the page with a certain number of lines, right? Here, in terms of form of poetics, the organization can be understood as two different types. We can talk about, first of all, the traditional versus the organic. That is to say, the fixed versus the free verbs. Go to page 662 real quickly in your hymnal, in your ARPS text. And I just want to point out a couple of things really quickly as we go through this. Notice on page 662 is my team plowing, the A.E. Hausman text. Let's just read the opening lines. I want to make a couple of quick observations. Notice, is my team plowing that I was used to drive and hear the harness jingle when I was a man alive? Now, there's two ways to read these lines. Study them with me just briefly. Notice I can read it this way. Is my team plowing that I was used to drive and hear the harness jingle when I was man alive? Look at the next stanza. I the horses trample, the harness jingles now. No chance though you lie under the land you used to plow. Now notice the last two lines that I just read. Look at them again in the second stanza. You can either read the lines or you can read the thought. Notice, if I read, no change though you lie under, and then take a pause, the land you used to plow, it's very difficult to know what it is that he has just said. We must read not the line, but the thought. Notice, no change though you lie under the land you used to plow. In other words, we want to be paying more attention to the thought than we do to the line. Key for your notes. Pay attention to punctuation. Punctuation will tell you whether you are to pause or not to pause. Notice that, for example, in the first stanza, there is no punctuation after lines 2 and 3. Likewise, no punctuation in the second stanza after the word under in line 3. Do you see that? In other words, you don't want to read the line, you want to read the thought. So it will make sense to you. Helpful note, reading poetry out loud is better than reading it silently. If you're stuck, for example, in a place where you can't actually physically read it out loud, then try and at least hear the words spoken in your brain, in your mind, as you're reading. Now, what's this thing about forms of poetry? Well, we have two kinds. The traditional form is the fixed form. Look at 642 really quickly in your book. We're going to jump around all over these pages that you were looking at. 642. Now we're looking at, of course, one of Shakespeare's classic poems. This is what we would call an example of a fixed or a traditional form. Anybody know what this is called? It's a 14-line poem, which makes it a what? 14 lines makes it a what? It is a sonnet. That's right. This is a sonnet, isn't it? Right? Okay. Notice that we've got several things we can say about this 14-line poem. For example, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Notice that the word at the end of the first line rhymes with the end of the third line. Do you see that? Day and May. Likewise, the end of the second line and the end of the fourth line, temperate and date, will both rhyme. It's what we call slant. A little bit of slant rhyme, but it's still rhyming. Do you got me? So in other words, a traditional or a fixed form is a form that has certain kinds of rules or understood guidelines. And then you work within those forms. A sonnet is a classic example. We have many of them. In Mali, we got a lot of them, and you'll see them as you kind of work through ours. All right? The second is what we call organic. This is what often we will refer to as free form or free verse. Look at page 954 real quickly. 954. And take a look at the poem at the very bottom. Spring is like a perhaps hand. Now this poem is a very different kind of poem for us to read. Notice, for example, right away, stanzas are not collected in any kind of 14-line arrangement. Likewise, the poem itself will require a certain kind of close reading. Spring is like a perhaps hand which comes carefully out of nowhere, arranging a window into which people look, while people stare, arranging and changing, placing carefully there a strange thing and a known thing here, and changing everything carefully. Spring is like a perhaps hand in a window, carefully to and fro, moving new and old things while people stare, carefully moving a perhaps fraction of flower here, placing an inch of air there, and without breaking anything. It's a beautiful poem about spring where he says, spring is like someone arranging stuff in a shop window, moving it around to make it look attractive. Somehow, spring appears to be something similar. And yet notice, Cummings is going to challenge us as readers. Look on page 955 again. Notice he says, spring is like a perhaps hand in a window, then the parenthetic, carefully to and fro moving new and old things, while people stare. But notice then there's supposed to be a break. And then the word carefully will begin a new thought. Carefully moving a perhaps fraction of flower here, placing an inch of air there. Notice there's no punctuation to tell you when to break. Well then, dude, how did you know how to read this poem so that it would make sense? See, this is the beauty and the genius of Cummings. You have to read it many times to be able to understand where does the break occur so that it makes sense. Think this is by design, intentional, or is it random? What do you think? Did Cummings mean to write his poem this way? Kind of goes without saying, right? Obviously a large amount of intentionality here. In other words, he is reaching out from the poem and saying, oh, no, 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 no. You don't get to just fly through my poem. You have to slow down, and you have to read it with some attention, and then reread it, and then read it again. In other words, you're going to learn how to read by learning how to read poetry. Read everything, because you'll learn how to critique closely. So right away, one of the questions that you always want to ask about it, for example, any of the 10 poems that you're going to study with me next session, is it a traditional form, or is it more of an open or organic or free form, okay? And that will help you in some ways to read it. You'll begin to learn there are certain authors like Shakespeare that always will write their poetics in traditional form. And other authors like Cummings, who the minute that you see it's a Cummings piece, for example, notice on page 954, the Cambridge ladies who live in furnished souls. Right away, when you look and see that, uh-oh, this is E.E. Cummings writing, right away you're going to know, uh-oh, I'm not going to be able to read this poem the same way I would read a Shakespeare sonnet. Okay, I'm going to have to read it with a different view in mind. Let's continue. We not only will look at in terms of form, we'll not only look at the way the poem looks, but we're going to pay attention to the way the poem sounds. Now here, we're talking about poetic elements of sound. We have several that we're going to list. Let's write them down. We're going to look at rhythm. We're going to look at rhyme scheme. We're going to look at repetition of words or phrases. We're going to look at, underneath that, alliteration and assonance and consonance. I'm just giving you a few examples of the types of things that we'll want to pay attention to. Go back to 642 real quickly. I told you we'd be jumping around a lot. One of the beautiful things about the Arts text is that he will give us a lot of examples of different types of poetic form, and we can practice that way. Let's look on 642 again at the Shakespeare sonnet. Notice there's two ways to read this. Watch, this is way cool. He says, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaf hath all too short a date. That's one way to read it. But there's another way for me to read it. Watch this. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Look at the last two lines. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Do you see it? All of that poem follows this ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. That ba-bum, ba-bum is what we will call iambic. And if you do 5 of those, ba-bum, 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 pentameter, 5, you've got an example here of what we will call within rhythm, iambic pentameter. Okay? Now this game that we're playing then has a lot to do with sound, and we're going to learn to pay attention to it. Of course, repetition of words and phrases makes sense. We'll study the ways that that's happening. What is alliteration? We're going to repeat consonant sounds at the beginning. Peter Piper picked a pail of pickled peppers. You've maybe played this game before. It's what we call alliteration. Assonance is when we are going to repeat vowel sounds inside of words. And consonants, we're going to play the game at the end of the words. Okay? Again, consonant sounds at the end of words. Moving quickly now. We'll also ask, along with this idea of form, we can begin to look at the issues of, now, figurative language. Now, let's pay attention to this for a moment. We're going to look at always at least 4 elements of what we call figurative language. Okay? The first is what we call the simile, the comparison using like or as. Of course, we can have the metaphor, the comparison without the use of like or as. It is one thing to say, she is like an oak tree, which would maybe mean what? We don't necessarily mean that she's physically large, even to say she's like an oak tree. What could we mean to say she is like an oak tree?
Strauss.
Well, yeah, right. While her mother was dying of breast cancer, she was like an oak tree. Means not that she's growing leaves, but rather we're making a comparison. She's strong like an oak tree. That's a simile. But we can say she is an oak tree. Or during the death of her mother, she was an oak tree. Notice I didn't use the comparison of like or as, i.e. simile, but rather I just went directly to the comparison. We will call this metaphor. And we play this game a lot in poetics. Of course, we're going to play it a lot in the other genres we'll study as well, but now we're studying poetics. Personification is a third one under figurative language. Personification. We're going to personify inanimate objects as if they have some kind of human tendencies. So, for example, we can talk about Miss Wright there having limbs instead of arms. Well, no, wait a minute. That's kind of a strange way to talk about her arms as limbs of a tree. Or, conversely, we can talk about Ruthie's tree out there not having limbs but having arms. Or shaggy hair of a willow, right? Branches. See how that works? That's personifying. We're going to see this happening a lot. Okay? For example, Cummings, we just heard, was personifying spring as if deity was moving things around in a shop window to say, look at me, look at me. And for example, for those of us who enjoy looking at trees in full bloom, it's fascinating to realize that tree just a few days ago, right, Miss Wright, was completely barren of any leaves. Why? Because it was in the middle of the winter. Well, it's not barren now. See how that works? And so we often will use personification as a way to try to celebrate certain things within the world of nature, for example. Finally, there's a thing called hyperbole. For a poem or a work of literature to be hyperbolic, we just simply mean that it is exaggerated. I'm hungry, I could eat a horse. Well, of course, you don't actually mean that you could eat that volume of meat. What you mean, of course, is that you're hungry, right? Okay, so to say exaggerated things, hyperbolic, all right? Now, obviously, we've left out some. Under sounds, we didn't mention onomatopoeia, buzz, for example, a word which sounds like basically what it is. But we're hitting now high points. So now, just to review. One way that we can look at a literary poetic work is to ask about its form, to ask about its poetic elements of sound or figurative language. Then we can look at the text from 2A's observation. That is to say, what's being said? What is the meaning of the poem? Let's turn now to the John Updike poem itself, Great Scarf of Birds. And let's do a little bit of internal annotation here. I'm hoping that as I look at your volume that there's some annotated work that's being done. If you haven't annotated this poem, get out your ready pen now and let's get ready to go to work. It's possible after our brief discussion here that you will decide, you know what, I think I'm going to maybe write my first paper on this poem. Maybe some of you will decide to do that. One of the keys always in writing good papers is to understand the question we are being asked. So let's study the prompt real quickly. At the top of your handout it says, you are going to write a well-organized essay. By the way, that's code language for skeleton guy. That's what that means, okay? Well-organized essay. And while it doesn't say it, the assumption in our time together is anytime you're writing one of these academic papers, you're always going to reference at least 5 pieces of external validation as well. And you're going to analyze how the poems, notice you're going to underline or circle or square these elements that they're going to ask you to focus on. Organization, diction, and figurative language. Prepare the reader for the speaker's concluding response. Whoa, now let's make sure we understand what we're being asked to do here, okay? As we said in your 1010 course, all academic writing is relational writing. By that we mean your thesis always will evince some element of A to B. In other words, you are always going to be comparing something to something else. In a 1020 class, this construction is usually very simple because the A is usually our text. In this case, John Updike's poem, right? Okay? But notice that we are being asked when we are working with this poem to pay particular attention to a certain part of the poem. Namely, what part? The conclusion, right? So we're going to be looking at the conclusive statement. At the very end of the poem, the speaker will go ahead and say it is Updike, but maybe not, but we'll assume Updike for our conversation, is going to say something at the end of the poem. Okay? But notice, this is crucial. You're not being asked if you like the Updike poem. Wow, I really like it. No, that's not the question. Rather, there is an element that's going to be relational to John Updike's poem. We're actually going to look at 3 themes in John Updike's poem, and it's right there in the prompt. Notice how I'm helping you to learn how to read the prompt. What's the first of the 3 things mentioned? Organization. Now, what does organization mean from the lecture that I just gave a few seconds ago? We're looking at what? What would we constitute organization as? What would we be talking about? It's our F word, isn't it? What was the word? You got it. Form, correct? So we're going to look at the form of the poem, the organization. Uh-oh, what's the next thing? This is one. What's the second thing listed? Now, that's an interesting word, diction. Now, what does that word mean? Do you know what that word means? See, because you're going to have a hard time writing this paper if you don't know what the word diction means. It is a literary term that means specifically word choice. Okay? Word choice. In other words, there are certain words that Updike is going to choose to use. Okay? We want to pay attention to some of those words. And then what's the third thing here that we're going to be working with in this essay? Yeah, now this figurative language thing we did here just now. Uh-oh, you even wrote it down, didn't you? What are the elements under figurative language that you just wrote down? We talked about what? We talked about simile. We talked about what? Metaphor. We talked about what? Personification, right? We even talked about hyperbole. Now, the reason why you wrote all those down is that you want to see if any one or all of those work in regards to this poem. Okay? Now, a key element in appreciating how to read a prompt for a 1020 class. There's always two elements to the essay. I've often taught it this way. What it is and how does it work? I'd write that down because the information I'm giving to you now is crucial. What it is and how does it work? What do you mean by that? Simply this. You can go to John Updike's poem and find a simile. But that's not what you're being asked to do in this essay. You're asked to comment on how a simile helps prepare the reader for the final conclusion. The simile is what it is. But we're interested in how it works. Do you got me? Do you got me? So in other words, sometimes students will misunderstand and they'll go, oh, in John Updike's poem, well, he has this kind of form, he has these interesting words that he chooses. Here's an example in line 17 of a simile. Here's an example in line 23 of a metaphor. He definitely uses personification. You know what I'm saying? In other words, all you do is talk about these elements from the poem, but wait a minute, you haven't told us how any of these work. What are they doing to help prepare the reader for the final conclusion? Do you got me? Okay. Now, for those of you who say, oh, crap, I didn't do that in the paper I wrote, remember, we're calling that paper a what? Diagnostic. A first attempt. For those of you who decide to write on this poem for your paper number 1, call it an early draft. That's why I recommend you save everything. Because after our conversation here, you'll probably go back and go, you know, I think I probably need to rewrite if I'm going to submit for my final formal paper number 1 in the next meeting packet, okay? Before you even look at the poem, you want to make an outline that looks something like this to understand the prompt. Now notice I gave you the assignment of the next paper to be 3 important messages, level 2A, right? 3 important messages from one of those 10/11, if you want to count the Updike poem, poems. Okay? Now, that is a little bit different. More complicated or less complicated in this question? What do you think? Asking you to write on 3 messages, is that more complicated or less complicated in this? Way less complicated, huh? This is a far more complicated essay. Would you agree with me? Notice at the very beginning of this, of our time together, I gave you a pretty complicated question to write on. Why did I do that? Well, I wanted you to already get a sense of the direction we're headed. By the end of our course, you should be able to pick up a topic like this and go, oh, okay, I get it. Of course, to be able to do this, what's the first thing you got to do? Well, you got to be able to read at level 1, don't you? Right? That is to say, you got to be able to read the poem well enough to know what does he say in a conclusion. Agreed? Then, secondly, you got to be able to work at level 2, most particularly here at 2B, huh? Where you ask about things like organization and word choice. So as you're reading the poem, you want to be annotating or taking notes, right? Looking for each one of those things. Of course, it's awfully hard to find a simile if you don't know what a simile is. Would you agree with me? It's awfully hard to find personification if you don't know what personification is. Would you agree with me? Right? So it makes sense, first of all, that you understand what we mean when we're talking about those things. Right? And hopefully by the end of our time together, you're capable of doing that. Okay? Any questions about the writing prompt itself? So as we get ready then to look at this poem, we're obviously going to spend time paying very close attention to the conclusion of the poem, right? John Updike's Great Scarf of Birds. Playing golf on Cape Ann in October, I saw something to remember. Ripe apples were caught like red fish in the nets of their branches. The maples were colored like apples, part orange and red, part green. The elms, already transparent trees, seemed swaying vases full of sky. The sky was dramatic, with great straggling V's of geese streaming south, mare's tails above them. Their trumpeting made us look up and around. The course sloped into salt marshes, and this seemed to cause the abundance of birds. As if out of the Bible or science fiction, a cloud appeared, a cloud of dots like iron filings which a magnet underneath the paper undulates. It dartingly darkened in spots, paled, pulsed, compressed, distended, yet held an identity firm. A flock of starlings, as much one thing as a rock. One will moved above the trees, the liquid and hesitant drift. Come nearer, it became less marvelous, more legible, and merely huge. "I never saw so many birds," my friend exclaimed. We returned our eyes to the game. Later, as Lot's wife must have done in a pause of walking, not thinking of calling down a consequence, I lazily looked around. The rise of the fairway above us was tinted so evenly tinted, I might not have noticed, but that at the rim of the delicate shadow, the starlings were thicker and outlined the flock of as an ink stain in drying pronounces its edges. The gradual rise of green was vastly covered. I had thought nothing in nature could be so broad but grass. And as I watched, one bird, prompted by accident or will to leave, ceased resting, and lifting in a casual billow, the flock ascended as a lady's scarf, transparent of gray, might be twitched by one corner, drawn upward, and then decided against, negligently tossed toward a chair. The southward cloud withdrew into the air. Long had it been since my heart had been lifted as it was by the lifting of that great scarf. Now, let's just say it out loud. I mean, we're obviously in the presence of greatness in a poem like this. I mean, Updike is doing all kinds of really important stuff. I mean, I could spend 3 hours just exegeting a poem like this. But let's go ahead and just pay attention really quickly to two things, okay? First of all, because they're on the whiteboard, right? First of all, let's pay attention at even just level 1 to the conclusion of the poem. Now, the way we like to think at level 1 is it's a dumb poem about, right? It's a dumb poem about. So we're going to put it in our own words. What is it a dumb poem about? Can you write it down? It's a simple narrative poem. It's a dumb poem about what?